If you think you can or if you think you can't, you're right, said American industrialist Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company. And Ford's famous quote points to the importance of confidence and self-belief. Bob Rotella, sports psychologist to some of the top golfers in the world, said that confidence is simply the aggregate of the thoughts you have about yourself. And in his must-read book, Golf is Not a Game of Perfect, Rotella makes one of the most insightful statements that you'll find in the sports psychology literature. It is more important to be decisive than to be correct in preparing to play any golf shot, particularly a putt. Rotella's wisdom applies equally well to golf as it does to other sports. It's just that in golf, the process occurs much more slowly, so it's a little easier to see. But because his book was written specifically for experienced golfers, Rotella uses golf examples. Golf is a game that involves moments of careful deliberation used to determine what type of shot to attempt, what club to use, and where to aim the ball. Because ultimately, golf is a target game. In golf, there are two processes involved in each shot: making a decision and executing a course of action. At higher levels, golfers even have a caddy to consult with as they make strategic decisions. And together, player and caddy may account for distance, changes in elevation, the speed and direction of the wind, and the height and moisture content of the grass, among other factors, in choosing a target. Once a club and target are chosen, the player needs to execute the repeatable swing that they have developed at the driving range and during practice rounds. And while executing the swing, the player needs to focus on hitting the target and avoid the temptation to revisit the decision-making process that was used to arrive at the particular target. One really good way to do this is to concentrate their focus exclusively on the target. Obviously, a golfer can't actually look at the target as they take their swing, but they can keep the target in their mind's eye. If they find their mind drifting back into decision-making process, it is best to literally step back and come up with a course of action that they can be confident in. If a golfer gets indecisive and they start to question their decisions, their thought process might drift from, okay, hit that little spot on the fringe, to, well, maybe I should aim for the center of the green with extra backspin, to, but the greens are playing fast today, so maybe I should just lay up, to, but as long as I don't hit it into the sand, I should be okay. Bad things are going to happen, especially if the thought process drifts toward just don't thinking, as in just don't hit it into the sand or just don't hit it into the water hazard. Just don't thinking can lead to a phenomenon called ironic processing. Ironic processing means we do exactly what we're trying not to do, like hit it into the water hazard. Ironic processes occur because our behavior usually follows our attention rather than our intentions. So your body usually does what your mind pictures rather than what your internal dialogue suggests. If the water hazard is pictured in your mind's eye and your thought process says, just don't hit it into the water, you're about to need a new ball. By the way, I actually think that while competing, an experienced golfer's swing thought should never be something linguistic like wait back or follow through, but should be something visual like the target held in your mind's eye. And the golfer might even try a little imagery exercise by imagining in their mind's eye a fighter plane type missile system narrowing in on the target and locking in before they begin their swing. This may seem a little silly, but sometimes the silliest interventions are the most effective. And since this little imagery exercise happens in your head, nobody needs to know about it. Confidence means nothing without focus. But when an experienced golfer is completely focused on a target, confidence doesn't really matter. Neither does anxiety. Because when we are truly focused on a target, in a target task, our muscle memory takes over. Through thousands of hours of intentional practice, elite athletes are able to develop habits that can work without conscious control. Expert performers are unconsciously competent in their area of expertise. To explain what I mean by unconscious competence, think about driving a car. There are routes that you may drive frequently, like between your home and school or work. So after thousands of hours behind the wheel, you can become unconsciously competent at driving. So you can hold a conversation with a passenger, talk on the phone over Bluetooth, or think about a presentation you need to work on without crashing. After your driving habits take over when you are thinking about something other than driving, you arrive home safely despite your little daydream. Have you ever had the experience where you meant to stop at the grocery store but missed your exit because the habit of driving to your house took over? This phenomenon is called highway hypnosis, and it's possible because we are unconsciously competent at driving, so our autopilot takes over. For experienced athletes who are unconsciously competent at their sport, letting their autopilot take control of techniques so that they can focus on tactics usually works best. In fact, one of the best ways for an expert athlete to mess up their performance is to think about the techniques they are performing. When athletes consciously control behaviors that can be unconsciously controlled, their performance tends to break down. And this is part of the reason why when frustrated athletes start to second guess themselves and their focus shifts from performing in the present to fixing past mistakes, they tend to make additional errors. And when athletes become preoccupied with the past and the possible consequences of those mistakes in the future, they tend to panic and take conscious control over well-learned behaviors. So instead of allowing their autopilot to handle the technique so that they can focus their attention on higher-order tactical decisions, the athlete disrupts their habit loops with conscious control and leaves their post, so to speak, when it comes to seeing the game unfold and making strategic decisions. And this panicky fire drill focus tends to lead to additional errors, and if enough mistakes accumulate, the athlete will eventually dial out, having resigned themselves to the belief that failure is a foregone conclusion. Making adjustments is one thing. In baseball and softball, the ability to make quick adjustments separates decent hitters from good hitters. After all, a hitter is facing a different pitcher each game, and sometimes each at-bat during a game, seeing a different pitcher with a different windup, a different release point, and a different set of pitches. But making quick adjustments while competing is different than trying to rebuild a swing. With hitting, like any sport skill, there is a time to train and a time to trust. Because as Bob Rotella wrote, it is more important to be decisive than to be correct. To be decisive, you need to trust yourself. And just like interpersonal trust, intrapersonal trust is developed over time. And it's developed most reliably by performing a skill correctly over and over and over and over again. Or in the nomenclature used by Albert Bandura to describe his self-efficacy theory, performance accomplishment influences efficacy expectations. And higher self-efficacy, or the conviction that one can successfully execute the behavior to produce the outcome, increases the likelihood that an athlete will succeed. And when the athlete succeeds, their self-efficacy tends to increase. So the relationship is cyclical. But notice that the circle spins both ways. So just as success increases self-efficacy, failure decreases self-efficacy. And this is why knowing what competitive position an athlete is in at any given time describes their recent past and predicts their immediate future. When athletes make mistakes and self-efficacy decreases, it puts them in a state of mind in which they are more likely to make additional mistakes. But when athletes succeed and their self-efficacy increases, their mindset becomes increasingly more favorable to peak performance, and the possibility that they will succeed increases. To prepare to achieve peak performance, repetitions are critical. A golfer is unlikely to perform well if they are not physically and mentally able to do so under pressure. And given that it is impossible to gain expertise in a skill without lots of practice, John Wooden was correct in saying that failure to prepare is preparing to fail. And notice that by preparing physically, An athlete is also preparing psychologically, because the most reliable way to build self-efficacy is through performance accomplishment. And some coaches who fail to prepare their players properly may cram for the test, so to speak, with silly motivational gimmicks. But these gimmicks rarely work because, like a baseball coach I played for used to say over and over and over again, pressure comes from not being prepared. It is much easier to focus when you trust your preparation, and much easier to feel motivated when you feel that you can succeed. When doubts and anxious thoughts aren't competing for real estate in our head, you're more able to focus on the little screw on the back of the rim, the little stitch on the catcher's glove, or a forward moving into space away from a defender. In sports, self-confidence means that you trust yourself, and this belief is usually based on past experience. But playing golf well or performing well in any other task doesn't just require confidence in your ability, but being confident in your decisions. This isn't easy. In fact, it can be really, really difficult. For every game played on the field or court or track or rink, there are mental games played in the minds of each of the participants. And those who are able to develop the discipline necessary to win the internal game by disregarding the emotional pull of past failure, and by remaining decisive as they perform well-practiced skills, usually end up winning the external game. And notice that even though winning the mental game is difficult, this internal struggle is what is under your control. So if you think you can win the mental game, or if you think you can't, you're probably right.